ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation.
Hey guys, welcome to our new video series, The Battles of the Civil War. The goal is to kind of cover a lot of battles we never hear about, and we'll of course cover some of the major battles. I'm trying to stay away from a lot of the politics behind it or the history behind it. This is more of a focus on the battle themselves. It'll just be a brief video for you guys to enjoy. The first battle we're going to cover is Fort Sumter. By February 1861, 7 southern states had seceded from the Union. These states immediately seized all federal property in their borders and claimed it for themselves. The last remaining Union piece of property in those states belonged to Fort Sumter, an island fortification located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Originally, the fort began construction in 1829 as a way to protect the fort from blockade. Even in 1861, only about 90% of the fort was finished due to cost overruns and lack of funding. It's kind of funny how these things never change through the years. During the same time, Major Anderson and 83 other men snuck into Fort Sumter. They were the last Union soldiers remaining in the area of South Carolina. They entered Fort Sumter from their original position in Fort Moultrie, an older fort that was located near Fort Sumter but was not nearly capable of withstanding a siege like Fort Sumter was. This was in violation of President Buchanan's last pledge as President of the United States that the Union would not antagonize the seceded states. This enraged the new southern states who thought Buchanan had intentionally violated his pledge, when in fact Major Anderson had done this without Buchanan's permission or knowledge. South Carolina established a bevy of artillery batteries around the fort. All their cannons were pointed at Fort Sumter. As President Lincoln took over, the decision was made to attempt to reinforce Major Anderson. Fort Sumter had originally been designed to hold 650 men and 135 cannons. With only the 84 men at the fort, they could only maintain less than half those cannons. In addition, most of the cannons were designed to attack ships, so the majority of them were pointed out into the sea and were of no use to fight against any southern land incursion. The North chartered a ship, the Star of the West, to transport 200 troops. These were to act as reinforcements for Major Anderson. As the ship entered Charleston Harbor, however, the South Carolina troops panicked and fired on it. The Star was forced to turn back with no injuries. Over the next 3 months of siege, the peace grew more tense. Supplies were depleted in Fort Sumter as the 7 states formed a constitution and a new Confederate government. When President Jefferson Davis took over, he commissioned Pierre G.T. Beauregard as Brigadier General. By the way, we're going to come back to General Beauregard later. I love that name. His job was to maintain command over the siege and over the Confederate forces in the area. President Lincoln did not want to start a war, so instead of resupplying his troops with troops and supplies, he chartered unarmed civilian ships to transport only supplies. He made it clear it was a humanitarian mission. This gave the South a choice: let the resupply happen or attack unarmed ships and be known for attacking a mission of humanity, as he put it, that was bringing food for hungry men. Jefferson Davis faced a different problem. Fort Sumter was the last symbol of an illegal Union force holding hostage a portion of the sovereign Confederate states. If Davis allowed his supplies through, it would keep a foreign nation's flag flying over their sovereign state. Davis warned Beauregard of the oncoming supplies, and wanting to avoid the situation, he ordered that Fort Sumter be taken before the supplies arrived. Only the Confederate Secretary of State opposed this, saying they would lose any allies in the North that they might have if they attacked Fort Sumter. Beauregard dispatched aides to Fort Sumter on April 11th to issue an ultimatum of surrender. Major Anderson refused. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, a single 10-inch mortar round was fired from Fort Johnson. The shell exploded over Fort Sumter as a signal to open the general bombardment from guns and mortars at Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, the Floating Battery, and Cummings Point. Under orders from Beauregard, the guns fired in a counterclockwise sequence around the harbor, with 2 minutes between each shot in order to conserve ammunition. Even the Southern forces had to worry about ammunition, but they were nowhere near the condition of Fort Sumter. Major Anderson held his fire. Awaiting daylight at 7 a.m., they fired a shot at the ironclad battery at Cummings Point and missed. Now, to clarify, an ironclad is a ship. I just want to make sure people knew that. It's not a name we normally use for ships in the modern day. Given the available manpower, Major Anderson could not take advantage of all 60 of his guns. He was forced to go down with only 21 of those guns. He deliberately avoided using guns that were situated in the fort where casualties were most likely. The fort's best cannons were mounted on the uppermost of the 3 tiers. The third level, the barbette tier, where his troops were most exposed to incoming fire from overhead. The fort had been designed to withstand a naval assault, and naval warships at the time did not mount guns capable of elevating enough to shoot over the walls. However, the land-based cannons manned by the Confederates were capable of high-arcing ballistic trajectories and could therefore fire at parts of the fort that would have normally been out of sight of the naval guns. Fort Sumter's garrison could only fire the 21 working guns safely on the lowest level, which themselves, because of the limited elevation allowed by their embrasures, were largely incapable of delivering fire with trajectories high enough to seriously threaten Fort Moultrie. They basically couldn't get the range because they couldn't fire high enough up. Ships that were sent as a relief expedition, namely the Baltic and the rest of the fleet behind it, began to arrive on April 12th. Although due to cannon fire from the Carolina troops and lack of warship support, they had to retreat back out of harbor and hope that Anderson and his men could hold out until the dark on April 13th. During the night, the Confederates reduced their fire to 4 shots an hour. The following morning, the full bombardment resumed, and the Confederates continuing firing hot shot against the wooden buildings. Hot shot were heated iron balls that would cause fires among wooden structures. By noon, most of the wooden buildings in the fort and the main gate were on fire. When the fort had paused its firing, the Confederates often cheered and applauded, and after the firing resumed, they shouted epithets at some of the nearby Union ships for failing to come to the fort's aid. Colonel Lewis Wigfall, a former U.S. Senator, had been observing the battle and decided that the fort had had enough punishment. He commandeered a small boat and proceeded from Morris Island to Fort Sumter. Meeting with Major Anderson, he said, and this is quoted by many sources, "You have defended your flag nobly, sir. You have done all that is possible to do, and General Beauregard wants to stop this fight. On what terms, Major Anderson, will you evacuate this fort?" Major Anderson was low on ammunition, fires were burning out of control, and his men were hungry and exhausted. Satisfied that they had defended their post with honor, enduring over 48 hours of continuous Confederate bombardment, and without losing a single man, Major Anderson agreed to a truce at 2 p.m. The Union garrison surrendered the fort to the Confederate personnel at 2:30 p.m. on April 14th. No one from either side had been killed during this bombardment. However, one of the restrictions that Major Anderson put on that they wanted to celebrate their leaving the fort with a 100-gun salute to the U.S. flag. During this 100-gun salute, a pile of cartridges blew up from a spark, mortally wounding Privates Daniel Howe and Edward Galloway, and seriously wounding the other 4 members of the gun crew. These were the first military fatalities of the war. The salute was stopped at that time after 50 shots. Union troops were placed aboard the Confederate steamer the Isabel, where they spent the night, and were transported the next morning to the northern relief ship Baltic, resting outside of the harbor. The resulting confirmed casualties for the battle were 0, not counting the 2 dying Union soldiers from the 100-gun salute, which both sides considered an accident. While it was probably the least deadly battle in the Civil War, it was the battle that started the bloodiest fighting and the most deaths ever suffered by the United States of America in any war, and that was the Battle of Fort Sumter.
The world will very little note or long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.